Welcome to the Portland Real Estate Podcast, Oregon and Southwest Washington's #1 show for real estate news and information. Without further ado, here are your hosts and a couple of guys who, as busy realtors and successful brokerage owners, know a thing or two about real estate. Steve Nassar of Premier Property Group and Joe Festolo of Soldera Properties. Hey, hey, hey.
Hey, hey. How are you?
Really good. Really good.
Awesome.
We have a very exciting guest today.
We do. Before we all break from the huddle and spend time with families and enjoy a little bit of R&R, of getting prepared for 2025 and spending, the holidays and the new year with family and friends, we are fitting in one more amazing podcast with Colin Mullane, who is the incoming first vice president of NAR, coming up soon. And then that's grooming him to be the NAR president for 2028. At this time, he will be running unopposed. So it's more or less a lock, but a lot can happen in 2-3 years. But it's nice to have Colin, who's been around forever, and he's been involved. You should see his bio. It's a rap sheet a mile long of all the offices he held and all the things he's done. And we're here to unpack some important stuff about specifically NAR, the changes, where we go from here, different MLSs, different rules for companies and protocol. So I guess before we jump into it, Steve, Colin, welcome.
Welcome, Colin. We're excited to have you. And he's one of our own. He's an Oregonian.
That's right.
That is right.
Has there ever been a president of NAR from Oregon?
I happen to know this. There were two, one in 1920 and one in 1942.
Okay. It's been a little while.
It's been a minute.
It has. So what I notice, it's my analogy is sort of like football. You could have a football coach that the team's doing well and they're winning all the time, but the day they lose the championship, that coach gets fired, right? And there's been some rumbling with our listeners and the membership about paying lots of money to NAR, yet here we lost a lawsuit. And what does NAR do for us? And they don't celebrate any of the wins they don't even know about. It's just they lost this one and they're grumbling about how much money it costs. And here we don't end up winning this lawsuit. So I guess to the incoming first vice president of NAR and future 2028 president of NAR, what can you tell us about NAR, and did NAR have our backs through this lawsuit?
Thank you, Joe and Steve, for having me on. And we had a pre-discussion, just so everyone knows that there's no question off the table here. There's nothing they can't ask me and nor probably will not ask me. So everything here is organic and from the scratch. But and just a quick correction, I'm a candidate for first vice president. We actually have a first vice president. So I want to make sure I'm not stepping on anyone's toes. Those are more NAR rules. But let's jump in. I think the challenge for a lot of our members, sure, we lost the lawsuit, and that was significant because the practice changes on top of the financial burden of the $418 million that we settled on. The practice changes were the biggest change in the industry, probably since the start of the industry, wholesale changes, right? I mean, if you've ever been a member of an MLS and they change MLS systems, it feels like it's pulling teeth. It takes everyone's complaining, why did we change? I like the old system or I like the new one. When we don't like change, period. So you put an industry-wide change in place with practice changes that are very significant. Everyone's paying attention. And so everyone's paying attention at a time when we had two significant resignations, two presidential resignations last year, this year and last year, if you want to be technical about it, and not with the best of circumstances. So we had all the wrong attention for the wrong reasons in the midst of losing the lawsuit. The question that you asked is, did NAR have your back, our back collectively? Yes, they did. They absolutely did. And they knew what they were getting into. This was a class action lawsuit. This is not a lawsuit over a seller and a buyer disagreement or a failure to pay a commission, the stuff that we work around all the time. We're not unfamiliar with the law when it comes to real estate, but we don't practice law in terms of class action lawsuits. It's a very, very different animal. And people say, and one of the things I love about Masters in Real Estate, and I've been a follower of this group for many, many years, and you've got a massive following from across the country, but the honest dialogue and the questions that come up are indicative of where members are at. And that's why I stay in there and stay engaged, because frankly, that helps inform me as to where people's concerns are. And I see a lot of conversation out there about, we dropped the ball, we didn't know what we were doing. And that's simply not the case. The person that sued us, Michael Ketchmark, I'm going to oversimplify it. I'm not an attorney either, but what I'll just say is it's a lot easier to sue 6 people than it is to sue 1.5 million. So yes, did every single member violate the terms? Did everyone go out there and practice badly? Absolutely not. I didn't. I never showed a listing based on the commission amount. I never worked with the buyer based on what the commission was going to be on the sale, and it changed a lot of the times. But collectively, we were put into a class action lawsuit because it's a lot easier to sue NAR and 5 major companies and say, here's the evidence that shows all your commissions are ending up in this particular range. Therefore, it's collusion. Therefore, we're going to go sue you. It's a class action lawsuit. And if we had been able to try the case under the rule of law terms, this is specific. Rule of law means, we get to go in and say, this is what it looks like. This is why we didn't do it. And all the things that people talk about and say, don't they understand what we do for buyers? Don't they understand what we do for sellers? What our value is? That we have different business models within our reach. We have discount business models. We have tiered business models where you can choose different levels of service from an MLS or from a realtor member and pay fees accordingly. None of that mattered in this lawsuit, and the judge agreed with the plaintiff's attorney and allowed it to be heard under a per se ruling, which only 10% of antitrust cases are held in a per se ruling case. And what that does is it immediately changes the landscape. That was the biggest shift in the lawsuit, frankly. It wasn't the information we had or how we defended ourselves, but it changed how we could defend ourselves because it automatically assumes guilt. And what they did is they took the university of one of the universities in Missouri, did some did studies on commission rates over a multi-year period, and they had a graph from 0 to 10%. And unfortunately, all the commissions that they studied, there was 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, and this massive peak in the lower third of it that clearly showed that commissions are in that range consistently. And that was enough to demonstrate collusion and antitrust behavior. And it fit the model for them to put into per se. And so, yes, NAR came out and said, we're still going to win this case. We feel very good about the case. We have to say that. No attorney is going to leave a case. If you've got, I hate to use this example, but if you have a mass murder on your hands and you're the defense attorney, you're going to come out and say your client has a chance. That's just the job. That's what you do. You can't show weakness and say, you know what? And that really frustrated a lot of our members. They felt like they should have been allowed to understand more about what we were doing and how that defense happened. So when we lost the case, a lot of our members were completely taken aback, myself being one of them. I think that was one of the hardest days of last year.
October 31st. It was Halloween. I remember
it was Halloween. And the settlement date was the Ides of March. The irony is not lost on us at all. That's the biggest part is members told, look, you didn't tell us that we had a chance of losing. It's like, well, you can't. We all have sellers. We represent sellers all of the time. And if you have an overpriced listing, you still go to bat for that seller and try and get them the highest and best, even if it's overpriced. You're not going to call up the person and say, hey, it's overpriced, make me an offer. We're not allowed to do that. We have a code of ethics that says, and we have a fiduciary responsibility to our client through the real estate agency law. So we know we can't do that. But just to make it relative, we are in those positions ourselves on a daily and a weekly basis with our clients. And that's what our attorneys did. And that's what NAR leadership did and said, hey, we're going to win this thing. We can't show weakness. But ultimately, once we Monday morning quarterback it, the per se ruling and how we were going to defend ourselves shifted how that case went. And the jury did not deliberate long at all. It came down very, very quickly. And so we lost the lawsuit. I think for me, part of the biggest piece of that is that a lot of our members are frustrated about the settlement. But the key piece there is we lost it first. We have to remember, we didn't settle. We didn't give up. We didn't throw in the towel and go, we're tired of fighting this. Let's just settle. We lost first to the tune of $1.76 billion that automatically got tripled in one state, Missouri. And so we settled. And the reason we were able to settle as low as $418 million, which is not chump change at all, was because the practice changes that basically protected the seller from further exposure to what we were being sued for in the first place would happen by buyer-broker agreements, saying the buyers were going to do it. Michael Ketchmark had always pushed and wanted, and the DOJ still wants, that sellers not have the ability to pay commission under any circumstances to a buyer-broker. And so NAR fought for that and said that's non-negotiable. Of all the things we're going to negotiate, that's off the table. We will make buyers sign a buyer-broker agreement with their buyer-brokers, but we will not disallow sellers. DOJ is not happy about that. We continue that fight, but under the terms of the settlement, we preserved that. So as bad as the settlement felt to people, there were a lot of things NAR did, as well as get thought up.
I'm glad you preserved that, by the way, Colin. I mean, that is huge. That is huge that that was preserved. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't love their premise of, hey, if you take a wide range of commissions from 0 to 10%, for example, and then all of them seem to be right around the same. Well, doesn't the market kind of set the commission? I mean, imagine someone's buying a new Mercedes, right? And you can go get one at any dealership, and for that make, model, and all the features, they're going to be pretty close because the market dictates that. So they're
Imagine if you took all the class action lawsuits that have ever happened and how much the lawyers kept. They're all going to be right in that 35 to 40% range, right?
But we're not allowed to
yeah.
talk about that. They set up some self-preservation modes there that says, well, we're going to be doing the suing, but you can't sue us for the same behavior. Sorry.
Yeah.
And that clearly, that's not funny. I mean, we're laughing at it, but that's the fact of the matter. I mean,
It's ironic. It's ironic that we were under the gun for that, and then they're taking that exact amount that they've always done.
Yeah.
But the premise is what kills me, because look, antitrust laws, you can't blackball a listing that has a low payout. You can't price fix. You can't get together and say, hey, let's all charge this commission. That's the antitrust laws. But to say something like, hey, all of your commissions are about the same, so that shows collusion. Well, the market dictates what the commission is. Obviously, if your commission's too high, no one's going to list with you. They're going to go with someone else. If it's too low, but you don't provide all the things that someone provides as far as marketing services that has a little bit higher commission. So the market sort of dictates.
If it's too low, then it doesn't work. It doesn't work, and you're not going to take listings, right? Or work with buyers.
And so using that premise and say, hey, you know what? All the commissions seem to be all about the same. Therefore, you guys did something bad. I don't love that premise.
And unfortunately, the way it was presented, remember, it's a jury of our peers, or not our peers. It's a jury of the public. It's 10 members of public who don't get to hear or understand our business model the way that we do. And we weren't allowed to articulate that as the answer because they were trying to get the ruling for per se. So they weren't trying the case at that time in terms of the actual case. They were trying to say, hey, we need to change how it's tried. And so the mechanics are a little different than being up there and saying, hey, to the jury, everything that you just said, Joe. And we compete. We know this on a daily basis on that exact thing. Like I said, I've never not shown a property. A lot of times I'll get to the closing table. I have no idea what the commission had been on that MLS because I didn't check it. It wasn't important to me relative to the service to the client that I'm trying to provide. And that's a fact. I mean, and I can say that, and I know a lot of your viewers and a lot of your followers can say exactly the same thing. So it hurts when they feel like that they get thrown under the bus at the same time when they've been practicing it diligently and well the whole time. I think the other thing to remember is there were several other large firms that were co-defendants with us, Anywhere Real Estate, Keller Williams, Remax, and others that were named in the lawsuit. Two of them settled before we lost, right? So that was a shot across the bow. Wow, large firms are settling. NAR had always promised each of those co-defendants that we would stay in this. No matter what, we would stay in this, and we did. We still lost, but it stung a little. And there were business decisions. I can't fault them for those decisions. This isn't a criticism, but it stings, right? When your partners in that particular piece leave and create settlement.
It shows guilt, right?
It doesn't help. Again, you've got a jury of your peers and you see, The other thing is that they used some training videos from some of those firms. And the larger the firm, the more likely those videos get to hit online. And there was a lot of discussion about don't work for less than X percent commission. Now, on a firm-to-firm basis, that's okay, right? I can dictate in our company what we will and we won't work for. And you can choose to work for a different company if you disagree and you have a different alternative. We can do that. I can't talk to you guys about that or anyone else on this podcast, but that's allowable. So when you take a large firm with tens of thousands of members, that's a training video that often leaves company lines and they talk about commissions at the higher level and how to defend them and things like that. That's not helpful either. So they were clever enough, as plaintiffs' attorneys are, in gathering enough information to sow the seed of doubt amongst a group of jurors that clearly don't understand our business. And let's be honest, our business is unique in this country. There's no other business that I know of, none other, commission-based or otherwise, that functions the way that we do when we collaborate. So the MLS system is unique in the world. There are other MLSs, but they weren't the way that they are in this country and how we share data. So I'm originally from Ireland. If you want to go to Ireland and England, and this is what the DOJ, Michael Ketchmark, specifically state, they name Ireland and England and Australia, where real estate's transferred differently there. And they say it should be like that because the seller pays a lot less fees. Let's also understand the buyer has no representation. If you walk into a real estate company in Ireland and say, I want you to represent me as a buyer, they don't know what you're talking about. It's not a thing that happens there.
Kind of like renting here, kind of like renting in our market.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. And just like a renter, you've got to go from office to office to office to see the inventory. So I might really want to work with you, Steve, and say, you've got the listing I want, even though you're not representing me. I think you're going to help me out get this sale, but you may not have the house. I have to go to Joe. And maybe I don't like Joe, but I have to go to Joe because he's got the house.
Yeah.
That's how it is. And it takes 8 to 12 months on average to close a transaction. Those are the things that people forget about when we go back to the original question, did NAR have our back? These are the things NAR still protects. These things and how real estate's transacted in this country are unique in the world. I mean, I'm not exaggerating here. We were just in Boston for the conference. There were 11,000 attendees. 2,000 of those were international attendees from other countries. They come to us to learn how we do it here. They don't come here to tell us how they do it. They're learning from us so they can take it back. Ireland just this summer got its first ever seller's property disclosure law. It didn't exist. If you bought a house in Ireland, as soon as it closes, all liability that might have followed the seller if they lied to the buyer about the condition of the property dies with them. So the deal's over. Sorry, buyer, you missed your opportunity. You had to examine every single thing, even if the seller lied about it. The Irish went to the Irish legislative body and said, this is how they do it in the States. This is consumer friendly. This is what realtors have done in America. We should do it here. They agreed and they implemented it. It's 2024 and they're just getting to it. And we've been doing it that way for years. So one of the things I say is I'm sick and tired of Michael Ketchmark and the DOJ telling me the grass is greener somewhere else. And unfortunately, our members are starting to believe that because if all you hear is negative, 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 we still have an exemplary example of how real estate is conducted in the world. And as much as the settlement changed things, it's still the best model, bar none. No one's better at it than we are.
Well, it keeps honesty. So we have to keep our records for 6 full years, for statutes. Now, that doesn't include fraud or misrepresentation where there's no statute. But I think that puts people on the hot seat that they need to fill out disclosures, disclaimers, advisories. They need to do everything to the best of their knowledge, right? So they can say something factually incorrect on the disclosures, but if they're not aware of a problem, they're answering it to the best of their knowledge, but it's that statute that a buyer can come back and if the seller says, yes, I decommissioned the oil tank, and they didn't, they just cut the flue pipe off and covered dirt over it, they're going to come and get you if they notice it or when they notice it, and fraud and misrepresentation has no statute. So I'm glad that they're taking that from us back to them. I believe NAR had our backs as much as many of our members are tired of paying exorbitant fees and what does it go to? And hey, by the way, we lost. They kind of look at our track record and not necessarily all the good things they have done, which leads me to another thing. So we haven't rehearsed any of this. We jumped on 10 minutes before the Zoom. Colin said, hey, fire some hot grounders at me. I'll answer anything. Nothing is taboo. I'm sure if something is taboo, we'll get the politician answer. But NAR had some sexual harassment stuff, and there was some mismanagement of money going on. Hopefully, they're
excessive spending by higher ups that was documented.
So, talk a little bit of what was that all about, and does that have anything to do with this lawsuit?
No, first of all, it has nothing to do with the lawsuit. That's an easy answer. It happened at the same time as the lawsuit was going on, so it wasn't helpful. It wasn't helpful anyway. Look, NAR has 1.52 million members at the last count in October. The largest trade association in the world. And we are a dues dollar organization. And we had 2 resignations.
Say that again. Say that last part again. A dues dollar?
We're a dues collecting organization.
Okay.
That's what funds the organization primarily.
Got it.
if you look back, there was a resignation. I think it was August 28th of 23, and then there was another resignation on the 8th of January this year, just this year, and for different reasons. I'm just going to say that that's the politician answer. The what I will say about the sexual misconduct allegations is exactly that. They were allegations. There was an article published in the New York Times in June of 23 that highlighted a lawsuit that was since revoked. A week later, the accuser said, "Hey, you know what? I'm revoking the lawsuit." We don't get a lot of information around the reasons why and what. And so I will say there was nobody was ever found guilty of anything.
And it was not settled. It wasn't settled.
No, I don't believe it was.
Okay.
You know what? I'm going to give an I don't know answer to that. And that's a genuine answer. I don't want to say absolutely not and then find out later somebody sees this and go, actually, Colin, you were wrong. I don't want to be wrong. So I'm going to say I don't know. I don't believe so, but I don't know. Okay. But that's a really good question, because that was part of the articles that were going on. It's an NAR just going around settling everybody and just making it go away. And I think that to a degree, there may have been some of that in the past, but I'm not privy to that. I don't know if there was in that particular instance. But there was enough smoke and enough fire and enough pressure on last year's president that we have some serious issues at hand, and we need to be focused on those issues and not the smoke that continues to come out of that side of the camp. And so he resigned, that resignation was accepted, and the incoming president was immediately slotted into that place. And then she took official office. Well, she'd already been official, but then resigned on the 6th of January. There were accusations of blackmail and that she was forced to resign. A different set of circumstances. And I want to be very clear about that.
Not looking good, Colin.
No, not at all. I'll be honest with you. That day, January 8th, I went into to Rite Aid for a shingles shot. And I didn't take my phone in with me. I'm in and out in 10 minutes. I'll leave my phone in the car, which I never do, but I did that day for whatever reason. I was in and out in 10 minutes. I got back out to the car. It's a Monday morning. It's like 10 a.m. And my phone is blowing up. And my phone does not blow up like this. And I was, what is going on? And a friend of mine who actually works in our market down locally called me and he said, I said, how's it going? That's why I always answer him with the phone. And he goes, weird. And that is not an answer he ever gives. And I'm like, what do you mean? And he goes, Kevin's president. And I'm like, what are you talking about? So as he's on the phone, I'm on my Apple Play in my car. I'm parked and I'm scrolling through the phone and I hit the email. I'm like, what the heck is this? And Kevin Sears is a friend of mine. And I'm not saying I would have known, but I had no idea that this was coming. And I went home. I made a few more phone calls, but I was completely overwhelmed that day, mainly because we had just gone through the previous resignation and we'd lost the lawsuit. And this just felt like, will there be an NAR next week, next month, next year? I mean, it really felt like things were falling apart very, very quickly. And I'm not in the middle of it at this point. I'm still running for office. I'm not on the leadership team, but I literally had to go on a hike that day. And that's what I do to clear my mind. And I normally do a 5-mile hike. And I had decided to go for dry January. Terrible idea. It wasn't the month for that. And so I called my wife and said, I'm going to extend my hike. I'm calling you to let you know. I don't want you to think I buried myself in a bar somewhere, but I'm going to extend my hike an extra 5 miles. And I did. I went on a 10-mile hike and I got home that night. I didn't have a drop to drink, but I didn't want her to be worried that I decided that's what I needed to do. But that was a hard day, a really hard day, because I didn't have a vision of where we recover from this, what that looks like, because you take it personally. You know, I'm out here trying to campaign and do the best that I can. And all of these blows resonate personally too. Like, hey, how do we know you're not going to be any better? What are you going to do? So that was the resignations and the reasons behind that. And again, non-specific. The money piece, that's a harder one, actually, to a degree, because you have people that are spending money unnecessarily. So there were two pieces that came out in the last New York Times article. One of them were salaries to the CEO and to some other senior NAR staff. That's a hard one for members to understand. So if you're the CEO of the National Association of Realtors, like I mentioned, 1.52 million members, you're managing a $400 million annual budget. You have 350 staff, 4 buildings. A $2.6 million salary is commensurate with the role. Now, that feels unrealistic. The same article openly acknowledged the average, which feels high to me, given how many of us produce. The average salary of a realtor, and we don't work for salary, of course, but the average income for a realtor on an annual basis is $56,400. You can't make $56,400 and possibly understand why the CEO of the organization you pay hundreds of dollars to every year makes $2.6 million. But that's what it takes to hire and retain talent to run an organization of that size. And I'm going to be perfectly honest and say that that's not an excuse. That's just acknowledge that we as realtors are not experienced in that world. So when we see things like it feels gross, it feels grotesque. Who makes $2.6 million? Well, anyone that wants to run an organization that big. And that's what you have to pay, again, to attract that talent. It's not like Joe and Steve are going to say, you know what, for 300,000, I'll do it. Because you don't know what the role is. You don't know what the job is. You don't know where you're going to be living, what the cost of living is going to be like, the hours that you work. And I will say it's a massive undertaking. So that's defensible. The same article talked about members paying thousands of dollars for Hamilton tickets. That's inappropriate use of money. And some of those were highlighted. That's a grotesque use of money. I mean, and if you hear that, it completely undermines the faith of the members.
Didn't it bring into question the tax status of NAR too?
It did. It did. I mean, that article, I use this expression frequently in my business in terms of people that are commenting, not in my business, but in our professions. Like, that was the grenade that got rolled in the room at the same time. It's kind of like, hey, maybe IRS, you haven't seen it, but we have. Maybe you should take a second look. We hire accountants to make sure we stay in the safe space. That article openly acknowledges we are the largest trade association in the country. And so there really isn't a comparative model for it. That said, what I will say is, since Kevin Sears took office on the 8th of January this year, you not only have a leadership team that's extremely mindful of all of those antics and what's gone on. There had been some internal fighting going on about that types of behavior in the past. Honestly, we had already created some internal rule changes that would prohibit that type of grotesque spending where you're like, oh, I want to go to Hamilton. I'm going to be in Chicago. Maybe NAR will pay for the ticket for me. And I don't know how that actually happened in terms of, again, the mechanics, who asked and who they asked and how that happened. But there were plenty of lots of measures that were put in place that would prevent that. Things like we would have NAR leadership would always get picked up in a suburban, like a professionally driven car. And now leadership travels around in Ubers the same as everybody else. Those were decisions that were made before the lawsuit. They were happening anyway. The article is reporting on what happened in 2022 and previously. And there is a saying in NAR, and it's true. And it might be hard to believe, but it is true that it is a new day at NAR. I can't imagine going in front of the leadership team trying to defend exorbitant spending. So when I started my campaign, it takes money to run a campaign, and it takes our associations at the state level and at our region, which is 5 states: Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Alaska, Montana, to support my run. And one of the promises I made to that group as they decided to back me financially is that I would be an honest user of the money. I would never go out on a dinner and spend $500 on myself. It's not going to happen. I eat at McDonald's more often than I should, more than my wife wants me to. And I'm very mindful that it's member dollars that I spend. And that's exactly the message I'll carry forward with NAR. There's no part of this that's shiny going, oh, let's ride around in limos. There's a lot of work that has to be done. And the only way to earn the members' trust back is to be responsible with their money and to show that you're being responsible. And all those other trinkets need to go away. And I think it's been happening over the last 2 years, and leadership is acutely aware that members are watching, and appropriately so. It has to get better, and it is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, okay. So thank you for telling us NAR had our backs. You addressed the sexual harassment, the mismanagement of spending. We have lots of changes that have been implemented because of this lawsuit and this settlement. And before we dig into the changes, I think it's important for our subscribers and viewers to kind of understand how RMLS was sort of mandated to do what they did, because there's a little bit of RMLS and their changes, and there's been talk about NWMLS, and the difference between the two is RMLS is realtor owned, NWMLS is not. The other thing is you do not have to be a, quote, realtor, trademark the name realtor with NWMLS. So you don't have to adhere to the code of ethics. So before we kind of talked about the practicality of buyer rep agreements and only getting your commission for the listing side, let's first kind of talk about how this mandate kind of changed what RMLS had to do, because they were responding to what they were told to do. Can you kind of talk about that and their changes?
Yeah, absolutely. So the settlement did several things. it gave coverage to every realtor member um, from from the lawsuit. So think about this: we lost the lawsuit, and then he immediately filed 49 lawsuits in all the other 49 states. And that's the writing that happens automatically. We expected it. We knew that was going to happen. So if you were in Oregon and kind of going, hey, but at least that's just in Missouri, that doesn't affect me. Clearly it does, or it's going to. And so what NAR did when they settled is they said, here's the sum of money. It's enough pain. We've got to turn over our books. They take a look at our books and they say, we can extract this amount of money without totally killing NAR financially. It's going to be painful. But also these practice changes that demonstrate we weren't just in it for the money, because look at this, we got them to change. And so what was negotiated by NAR under the terms of the settlement was protection for all realtor members, unless you were a realtor that was a member of the larger firms that hadn't settled independently yet. Okay, so they were still so if you were with, I think Keller Williams was later, EXP were later. So if you were an EXP agent, a Keller Williams agent, you personally weren't covered yet. They settled later. That coverage now arrived. But for every other realtor member, myself included, we own a small firm. We have 11 agents. And we had serious discussions. Two other owners. We're 3 owners and out of 11 agents. And we're not massively powerful or big or anything like that. But we do a fair amount of business. But we had some significant discussions about whether or not we could keep the doors open if we got hit by a class action lawsuit. So Catchmark wasn't going to sue us. But we were seeing copycat lawsuits spring up across the nation that were targeting successful teams, successful brokerages, which we would show up in our MLS as. MLSs and small associations. No longer was NAR the only defendant in these cases. They were starting to name state associations, small associations, MLSs, brokerages, small brokerages, and teams. We had to seriously consider how we would fight that. And if you get named in a class action lawsuit, you must retain an attorney to fight that. There's only a handful in Oregon. They charge an average of $2,000 an hour. We had about 30 hours we could have paid before we were going to have to throw in the towel and go, we can't do it anymore. So we were looking at a business that was open for 18 years. We pride ourselves on service. We do an amazing job for our clients. We work really hard at understanding how to be the best at what we do. And we felt we were going to have to close shop. When we found out that NAR settled and we got the coverage, it was a huge weight off our shoulders. Now, our agents didn't know that. They didn't know the 3 owners were having to sweat that on a daily, weekly basis with different meetings with different companies that we might have to go talk to. So that gave us a huge sense of relief. Now, the rest of our agents didn't necessarily feel that relief. But the actual practice changes, there was a settlement spelled out who was covered. Everyone was covered provided they adhered to these following things. All realtor-owned MLSs, if they adhere to the rules. If the realtor-owned MLS decided we're not going to adhere to the changes, then they weren't covered. But all realtor MLSs were smart and said, you know what? You fought the fight. You're paying the money. You paid for the attorneys. You got it done. We will perform to that standard. Non-realtor-owned MLSs were similarly allowed to choose whether they wanted to or not. And if they wanted to, they were prescribed a mechanism by which they could follow the terms of the settlement, go directly to Catchmark and go, this is the amount we think we're liable and we'll pay you. They would have had to pay over and above. They weren't covered in the $418 million. So they would have had to negotiate separately and say, here's $1 million, $2 million, $3 million, I don't know, whatever, a Northwest MLS. And I'm sure they probably had some people looking at doing that. So Northwest MLS decided publicly, we're not going to settle with you. We don't believe we violated any rules, and they continue to do business as is. Each one of us is protected under the terms of the settlement up until the moment we break any of the pieces of the term, including the changes of the practice. So if you say, you and I, Joe, I'm going to join Northwest MLS, I'm immediately opting out of the coverage that I'm currently covered by. And I'm immediately placing myself back in the line of fire for that lawsuit that continues in those 49 states. And it means that when that gets settled, when that gets resolved, however that, now if they win, that's a different story. And maybe they feel that they would win that lawsuit. And that'll be interesting to watch and to see. But if they don't, I personally, as a business decision, would not opt out of the coverage that was so hard fought for and won, even though the changes of the practice feel bad. If you just want to go back the way things were, you're immediately exposing yourself to that new lawsuit. And so I think that's the primary thing to remember. And there are MLSs around the country that have not opted into it yet. There are still some companies that haven't settled, even though we've gone way past the deadline for that. They're still working in the background. You'll hear some people were kind of later to the game. I know John L. Scott was probably one of our larger regional companies that settled at or around, or maybe right after the date passed for the settlement. And they decided that they were going to settle as a company. So some companies and some MLSs have decided not to opt into the settlement agreement, which means the lawsuit continues. And I think anyone that's considering opting into an MLS that goes back to the way that it was, number one, you better be talking to your principal broker because it's really their decision. You can't just up and leave and go join an MLS arbitrarily. And I think they all require your broker permission anyway. But even brokers listening to this, be aware that you're covered today. But if you join one that's not, you immediately lose that coverage. And that's a business decision that each of us are going to have to make. Certainly not one that I would make. But I think that that's the thing to be acutely aware of. It feels like, oh, the neighbors to the north, we can go back to normal. Okay, but it's going to look a lot different for you in the future if you choose that, potentially.
So with what was mandated to be under this umbrella that we're protected through RMLS, RMLS had to adhere to certain things, which is no longer a listing agreement goes through RMLS. It goes through the real estate brokerage house to the seller directly. They had to remove any BAC and any BAC posting through any RMLS related aligned showing time, RMLS comments, private remarks. Is there anything else I'm forgetting? It's not posting the BAC and then removing themselves from the contract side, because it used to be you fill out the listing agreement, which was from RMLS, and they post the BAC. And if another broker brought a buyer to that particular house, whatever the BAC was in RMLS is honored because it was considered a contract. Now it's completely independent to broker and brokerage to the seller, and now with buyer rep agreements to the buyer directly. Were there any other changes aside from BAC and contracts being removed from RMLS?
So I'm going to correct you on one piece, but also let's not forget the buyer broker agreements and you did mention that, but that was a big change on the buyer side because this was a seller driven lawsuit. So technically, there are still 3 avenues for you to offer buyer broker compensation. And remember, we've got lots of listing agreements existing throughout the state now that are attempting to kind of work around this. You've got individual MLSs with their own listing paperwork. You've got OR forms. You've got OREF forms. So depending on which markets you're in, you have multiple forms to choose from, and they all attempt to do different things. So broker to broker compensation, which is what it was previously, is my firm saying to your firm, if you bring me a buyer, my firm will pay your firm. And that way, if I didn't pay, you're coming after my firm because we have a contract through the MLS. The contract through the MLS is gone, but I can still offer broker to broker compensation. You can call me and say, Colin, what's your compensation? And I'd say it's broker to broker and it's this percent. In which case, if I didn't pay, you would come after me directly because it won't be difficult to prove, more difficult because the MLS isn't going to touch it anymore. And our VAR, the associations aren't going to arbitrate that commission dispute any longer. They're out of that business completely, and they should be around the terms of the settlement. But the recommendation, the underlying fundamental problem with broker to broker is it could still get tied back to collusion of some kind around the client. And so most offices, ours included, have gone to a seller to broker compensation model. So my conversation with my seller is if an offer comes in requesting compensation from you and the offer is good, you will be paying it, Mr. Seller, Mrs. Seller, to the buyer's agent. Are you comfortable with that? So we've moved to a seller to broker compensation model, if that makes sense. And I think most people have, but that wasn't a requirement. It's the right thing to do to get further away from the argument they had in tying us to compensation. So that's an important one. And I think fundamentally the thing that people get confused about and they forget is these aren't NAR rules. MLS has rules that said, hey, if you want to be covered under the terms of the settlement, you must remove buyer broker compensation and you can't allow it to appear anywhere else. MLS created that rule because they don't want to get sued. They want the coverage. They created a rule to protect themselves. But ultimately, the settlement isn't an MLS rule and it's not an NAR rule. If I go out tomorrow and show property without a buyer broker agreement, NAR is not going to revoke my member status. The real estate agency is not going to. Real estate agency January 1 in Oregon will require buyer broker agreements. But let's talk about right now for just an example. If I go out today and show a buyer property without a buyer broker agreement, NAR doesn't care, Oregon Real Estate Agency doesn't care, my MLS doesn't care. Who cares? Michael Ketchmark. I just violated the terms of the settlement. So a lot of our members are confused because they're like, I can't find anything in the NAR rules. I can't find anything in the MLS rules. I can't find anything. It's not the 3 bodies that we typically work under that dictate how we do our business. This is the terms of a settlement of a lawsuit that we immediately expose ourselves back to if we don't perform to the standard of the settlement. So you're not going to find it in NAR rules. You might find it in guidelines. So that's the thing. That's the thing that people forget. MLS has rules to continue to protect them from that same lawsuit, but that's not the ultimate player here. It's Michael Ketchmark, and he had to settle all the copycats, and that's a big part of the settlement that we haven't talked about. All the copycats went away when we settled the big lawsuit. All the other ones came under his umbrella. He had to then go figure that out. So they all get a piece of the 418 million and the almost billion total he'll get from all the other companies. He has to make all of them go away as part of the settlement before the sellers in the class get issued their checks or being affected as part of that class. So that's a big part of it, I think, to remember.
Those monstrous checks, those massive checks.
Yep.
With 3 digits.
Yep. I'm seeing people like getting approached by their previous clients and go, hey, can you help me understand how much I paid you in commission? Because I wanted to get money from, and I'm not for or against that. The money's been decided, right? The money's in a pot and it sits in a pot until it's all taken up by the class. And so the attorneys are getting their 33%, 35%. It's actually more because they're allowed to take off the cost of fighting the lawsuit before they even get the 33%, which I think is crazy, but whatever. It's crazy out there right now. And our, to be called by a former client to ask you how much you were paid in a commission so they can be a part of the class action lawsuit that results is, I think it's disheartening. I can't blame them, and we're all going to get it. But, it's by the same token, it's like, well, it's just they're doing nothing if they don't, I suppose. But they were all collectively big changes.
With these changes, this is a question for Steve. Steve schleps a fair amount of real estate. Matter of fact, I was looking at some numbers, and I think you and your team were number one in Oregon, weren't you? Aren't you?
2. I think we're 2.
Number 2?
Wow.
Anyway, sell a fair amount of real estate. And now we have our contracts with the brokerage with the sellers. And then we are forced to have a buyer rep agreement with buyers. From a practical utility sense, Steve, when you write an offer on a house for some buyers, do you care what that listing agent and the seller have predetermined for a BAC? I mean, do you call first? Do you email? Do you care? Or do you just submit your offer and submit?
We just submit the offer. Yeah. We show it and then write an offer, and we haven't seen much issues. I honestly, Colin, we've done a lot of shows about this. It's great to have you here, and I've learned so much from you already. But I'll just tell you, I wouldn't have told you this a year ago, but I'm happy that this change happened. It's better for my business. I'm seeing good things. I like being in control of the buyer side. I like the cover that, hey, everyone has to sign a buyer agreement, so it's required. I like that cover, and that way we're always in a buyer contract with our buyers. I like that I can dictate what I want to make, not the listing agent through the BAC. And I generally like the decoupling of the commissions. I think it makes my listing presentations easier. I'm saying a much smaller number than I used to say when I'm having that conversation. So
I think it's all positive stuff because you have your own worth. I mean, if you're seasoned in the business, you do a lot of business. Maybe you are at a higher rate than someone who's brand new, and you are controlling your own destiny with your own commission. And it's not, gee, did the listing agent and seller decide to do something that doesn't seem to be competitive in our market? Is it lower than? We had no choice. If you didn't focus on what the BAC was, whether you wrote an offer or not on it or showed it or not, which is clearly against antitrust laws, now you're just submitting your own, this is my agreement with the buyer and they want you to pay it. And that number is created between you and the buyer. So I think that's great. There's a little bit of protection of, you don't have to like run around and herd your buyers every weekend and be with them for every open house they go to. You're protected in that realm. And I've had zero pushback every time I write an offer and we submit the commission demand to the sellers. I've never had a pushback. So holistically, I think the decoupling is better for everyone. And then the third thing that's really important is people who get into the business because realtors are rich and all you got to do is pass a not very difficult test and then you can go out and make millions of dollars and it's simple. Well, if you were a buyer rep only and you haven't even developed your marketing campaign and your listing presentation, if it's just like, I'm just going to work with buyers, it now forces them to be a little more professional and a little more knowledgeable because those buyers have to sign a contract with you. You need to sell yourself to buyers just as listing brokers need to sell themselves to sellers. I think it's good holistically for the community. And you have those who adapt and those who have left to do a different profession. And I think it's good for us holistically, these changes. And honestly, I haven't had any trouble. I don't care what the BAC is. I don't look for it. I don't call in advance. I just submit an offer. Here's the commission demand. They either accept it or they don't. They either accept the offer or they don't. It's transparent.
It is transparent. Everything you just said is true. The other underlying fact is that just like the last downturn in the market, and this is a different comparison, I get it, but who survived the downturn? The most professional among us, the hardest working. That's exactly who's doing the business today. The market's challenging too, by the way. That's the other part that makes us, if we were all out there selling real estate, people would moan about the practice changes, but I don't think they'd be paying as much attention to it. So when you create that much quiet in the space of transactions, because we're not transacting at the highest levels anymore, it makes for a very echoey room and a lot of noise. And I think that what I've seen from the people that are talking exactly like both of you, and we're in the same boat, is that we are having the serious conversations with our clients. We are moving them through the pieces, and they are willing to sign contracts with us to demonstrate our professional services that we're willing to offer based on our experience, time in the business, and our opportunity to succeed on their behalf when it comes to writing an offer or listing a property. The age-old question that we were asking for years: why would I pay Colin Mullane the same amount of money with his 25 years experience as someone that got in the business 5 weeks ago? That's a great question. What do they know after 5 weeks that I might know after 25? And consumers being aware to have a heightened expectation of professionalism is not a bad thing. It makes us better. It raises the bar. And the best of us will survive this. And that 5-week-old agent or 6-week-old, whatever they're doing it, if they're bound and determined, they will succeed too. There is nothing about this industry that promises success, but we all wake up with the exact same opportunity every single morning. And that's a fact. And so that's the beauty of this profession. 1.5 million members, and not every licensee is a realtor. So you've probably got 2.5 million people practicing real estate in this country. That's a huge amount of people by population. But we know that the percentage of people successfully are in this business that are actually working at it as a profession is probably closer to 25 to 30% tops. But the other 70% wake up with that same opportunity. How they apply themselves, what they do, is it full-time? Are they dedicated? Are they willing to work hard? Those are still the fundamentals to success. And they remain so post-settlement.
I believe if you are a realtor, if you look at the stats, I think realtors actually have a higher average than non-realtors as far as income. And I believe the professional services are far better. I couldn't imagine with the RMLS and WMLS, why would you pierce the protective shield that we have and go somewhere where you're subject to potentially another lawsuit? And I know you have a question about Clear, but on this topic that I do want to get back to a little bit later, Colin, you and I last week talked about a lot of times brokers are saying, hey, I'd like to hold an open house this weekend. And I'm with ABC Realty, and I don't care if the open house is listed by XYZ Realty, but that's really bad. And a lot of our members and brokers who aren't in ownership level, like the three of us, don't understand the coverage of E&O. And they don't understand that if you're a listing broker with a company and you're letting someone from another company hold an open house that has no paperwork signed with the seller whatsoever, that is a lawsuit waiting to happen. And any company that would allow someone from another company that has zero paper and documentation, it could very well look like breaking and entering. It's just some guys in the house for 3 hours. You have nothing signed with the seller, and it just takes one thing to go wrong, and that's a lawsuit.
Is that not an agency law? The real estate agency doesn't prevent that?
They don't prevent it, but here's the challenge. And so you've got there is a before the settlement answer, and then there's an after the settlement answer, and it's a little different. So the before the settlement that still exists is the risk management side of things. The listing company has a fiduciary responsibility to the seller to sell the house with a whole set and a host of expectations that are mutually agreed upon through the listing agreement. If the listing company and agent fully informs the seller that a non-realtor from that company is going to be holding an open house and that seller is in agreement with it, most of the fiduciary is covered by the seller, by the listing company. Because you're basically saying, hey, I've got nothing to do with them, but they're doing that. The liability doesn't go away, but at least the seller's informed. But this is how this conversation happens, right? Listing agent goes up and goes, hey, I'm out of town this weekend, but I know you want to do an open house. I've reached out to some friends in the business, and I've got Joe Blow coming over here from ABC Realty. He's a great guy. He's going to hold the house open. Who knows? He might sell it. Most sellers kind of go, oh, okay, if you like the person, that feels fine to me. That's not the same as the conversation the three of us would have with a seller and most other realtors that I know and say, hey, I'm not in town this weekend. I do have a friend in another company. They're not as part of the listing agreement. There are other things that will happen. They will only be working really for the buyers that walk in that door, trying to capture buyers. But there's a chance that one of those buyers, just like any open house, might like the house enough they want to write an offer. I will be representing you as a seller. That person will be representing the buyer. That's a different level of conversation. Go even further than that, though. This is the level that we perform to in our office. We would never allow that. We would never allow our agents to do that, number one, in terms of they would not host another agent's company's open house, nor would we ever have it in-house, because we don't know what the behavior of that person is going to be like, and they don't have any of the liability in hosting that open house. So somebody walks in, a buyer walks in, they steal something. Who's responsible? The listing company's responsible. How do you have that conversation with the seller? Damage occurs. They don't lock a door correctly. They leave a stove. The gas fire gets left on. The house burns down. I mean, I'm going to exaggerated examples, but this is where you have to go in your head to understand the liability you're creating when you do that. Now let's go post-settlement. And you look at the fact that this is the misnomer that's out there. People think that, hey, open houses are covered. It says specifically you're covered if you do an open house. Only agents for the listing firm are covered. And if you look at the listing agreement is between the seller and the listing firm. Never the agent, the listing firm and their principal broker, right? That principal broker can designate another agent from that office and transfer that fiduciary responsibility under the terms of the listing agreement and say, if you're in the same office, you can open that house because you're working on behalf of the seller. And because you're working on behalf of the seller, even though you're not on the listing agreement, you are on the same firm, you're covered under the terms of the settlement because that principal broker could designate you and then you are therefore covered, but you're working on behalf of the seller. Okay? And real estate agency rules recognize that. They always, always have. So the settlement is basically, this is part of the carve out for the settlement. Like, let's not have people at open houses have to sign it because we want them open to the public as the listing agent and the listing firm, the ability to do that. When you're not from the listing company, you are no longer covered under the terms of the settlement. And every buyer that walks in that house, in fact, before they walk in that house, must sign a buyer broker agreement. And agents and companies are getting this wrong and creating liability for themselves every single day. And this is a problem. I've had people answer me and say, yeah, but my attorney said it's okay, but my principal broker said it's okay. It's not. You're not understanding the terms of the settlement if you think for 1 second as a non-broker within that company, you can hold an open house and not have that liability follow you in the door with regards to the settlement. So I'm not critical of the business model. If that's your thing and you want your agents out there holding open houses for other companies and you think it's a good way to get buyers and they're new agents, that's fine. That's your business model. But please understand the massive risks that you're taking and you are not following the terms of the settlement. And once you break the terms of the settlement, they're broken, right? Your coverage is gone. Ketchmark comes back and find out you did a thing a year ago. He can come back and say, you broke the terms of the settlement. You're now liable. And I see that you make a bunch of money. I'm coming after you. That's how serious this is. And he's not taking it lightly. And he would love to find a couple of people to make an example of in all the states that he's going out for. So that's the open house piece.
And I believe, aside from not adhering to the listing agreement with your seller by being in the same firm, I believe our E&O insurance coverage has something that you just can't have some random real estate person from a different company come. It changes your aspect because the listing agent and company work for the seller. If you have another broker come in, then they're working for the buyer, have to get buyer rep agreements at the door for everyone to come in. and you don't get the insurance coverage. And so I want to get the message to the people that are like, hey, open houses are a great way to get business. Who has an open house I could hold open? And they're not talking specifically to their company. They're talking to all the companies. When you're way down the totem pole, you don't think about you're piercing the shield of your protection of both the listing agreement with your sellers and your E&O coverage. And there's a massive liability. All they know is I want to hold an open house. It's going to be sunny. I want to get a buyer. So you don't allow that in your company for your brokers to hold other listings from different companies or someone else from a different company to hold your listing open. That's just off the table.
Correct. Absolutely. And another interesting fact, E&O insurance is not required in the state of Oregon. So if you're dealing with a company that doesn't have the ability to call their E&O insurance to double check and make sure it's okay to do these things, that's an even bigger risk. They're taking that risk on every single day personally. And I wish that more agents and brokers would check with their owners and say, do you have E&O insurance? If we get something wrong in a transaction or I do something, do you have that resource? Because it's not required. And it's a massively important piece of our business.
Okay, Steve, I didn't forget. You brought up Clear. There's also like American Real Estate Association. They're sort of NAR rival trade associations. Why don't you jump into your question? You're probably asking like how that affects things in NAR.
Yeah. So the next battlefront, it seems like, in my observation for NAR, is this clear cooperation. There's been a lot of chatter coming out, and I think most of the people that are coming out have agendas. By the way, I think they have visions of things they want to do within their company that promotes their company and makes them look shinier, and so they're throwing sticks at clear cooperation. Tell us about that, Colin. Tell us NAR's stance on that, and what is there concern there? Is there what do you see happening? And let me also say one more thing. Clear cooperation is the rule that says if you are going to publicly market a listing within 24 hours, it has to be listed in the MLS and available for all to see. And that's a national rule that was enacted, I want to say 6 years ago, 5 years ago, something like that. So we all live under this rule today. It's a big deal. There's no more coming soons. I remember it wasn't that long ago. You'd go onto Zillow and you'd see some house that was coming soon for 3 weeks, and we couldn't show it to our buyers because it wasn't available to us. So it did away with all that stuff. So go ahead, Colin.
And Steve, that's the best point right there. Understand why Clear Cooperation was created in 2019 and made a rule. It was there to address the issue of coming soons. So my client would drive by a house. I've already promised them I'm going to show them all the listings in their price range with the criteria that they're looking for. They drive by a house that's coming soon. It looks like it's perfect for them. They call me and say, Colin, I found the house on 123 B Street. It says coming soon. Can you find out? I call the agent. Agent knows my number because it's saved in their phone. They don't call me back because they probably know I'm calling about the coming soon. My client calls the agent because now they're frustrated with me that I couldn't get them the information that I told them I'd be able to get them on all of the listings. They call the agent. Of course, the agent picks up the phone number for the one they don't recognize and sure enough offers to show the property. And before you know it, they're writing an offer on the coming soon because I never had a shot with telling my client about that property. The MLS is not a dumping ground for the listings you couldn't sell on your own. That's not the purpose behind it. It's actually designed on behalf of the consumer to give them the best. And we know that the consumer is best served when more buyers are looking at the house. So when we try and create these markets within markets and manipulate the information to benefit the company or ourselves personally, we violate the golden rule, right? Every rule that's made by NAR has some reason it was created. And this to me was one of the better ones. So when companies say, oh, that's foul, sellers should be able to do whatever they want to do. Okay. But if you're telling the seller, well, if your house is overpriced and we put it on the market within our large company for, let's say, 2 weeks and it doesn't sell, then we'll put it on the MLS and you're not burdened by 14 days on the market. That's disingenuous. And to me, that's intellectually dishonest. If your house is overpriced, it's overpriced, whether it's in-house or not. And if it sells in-house and it was overpriced, what does that tell the consumer? Did you price it high enough in the first place? The seller has a better sense of whether they got the price right or not by having more and more buyers come through, getting feedback going, you know what, compared to the competition, we think you might be priced kind of high, or we don't like this and we don't like that. We know the feedback helps our client.
Or if it is underpriced, a bidding war of some sort that clears the air. Whereas in your scenario, I mean, What if it's a small company? What if it's a small company and they put it as a coming soon internally or listed internally, but not on the MLS? And then somebody goes, "I'll give you your price," and they write them a check and closes. You'll never know what was it underpriced, right? There's nothing to.
We all have stories, right? And that's the thing is we have stories where those kinds of things have happened, or it gets out there that, oh my God, this one house went for 200,000 over asking, and it was all cash, and they come up from California. Like every seller hears that story too, because you hear it every time you go to a listing appointment now.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is the market functions best in an open market space, and I think the DOJ would do well to pay attention to this. What they don't understand, and what our members, why we need to do a better job of telling our story to the DOJ, is they don't understand our business. They don't understand that the three of us can compete fiercely for a listing this morning. Fiercely talk about how well we do, how we're going to be better than each other, how we're going to do all these things. And whoever gets it, we're going to try and sell it. Not only that, but we might go out and have a drink tonight too. That blows their mind. How can you compete that fiercely and still like cooperate in the same way? Because the business model is so unique. It doesn't mean it's flawed. And if the only opinion you have of that is that it's flawed, then you misunderstand how we do it and how the consumer benefits from that. I can negotiate the heck out of a deal with you, Steve, and you're going to negotiate the best for your piece, but I don't have to be a butthead as I do it. I'm utilizing skill, experience, and the best purpose for my client while continuously communicating with my client to make sure that I'm acting in their best interest and with their instruction and giving them guidance and advice. That's how we function. I don't have to whisper in your ear like, hey, I think my buyers want this or that. We don't do that because we function at a higher level. And I think that if the DOJ understood our business more, they would be much bigger advocates for things like clear cooperation. And I think that larger companies are utilizing this time period right now of dissatisfaction amongst members and realtors through the lawsuit, everything that's happening at NAR to kind of go, hey, let's disrupt even more. And I think the MLS is fundamentally the right place to be for the consumer's information and data. And let's be honest, if I only have 40% of the data or 10% of the data, I can't do an accurate market analysis. We depend on that. The appraisers can't do it. If we silo the data and the information, there is no benefit to the consumer that I can see other than the company benefiting from that instant gratification of double siding a transaction. And that's dishonest.
So where does this go? What's happening right now? Is it all talk? What are you envisioning happens here?
So there's multiple things at play. So when the DOJ reneged on its deal that it made with NAR 4 years ago, the Trump administration, and none of this is commenting positively or negatively on any administration. These are just facts. We had an agreement that we were going to publish our commissions in public facing to buyer broker commissions on public facing websites like Zillow, Realtor.com, even our own IDX feeds that we'd say, hey, this is how much we're getting paid. They wanted us to do that. We could no longer say that our services were free. And there was one other thing, and I forget about it. These were minor changes, especially relative to what we have now. And we agreed. And then the new administration came in and said, you know what? Actually, no, we're not happy about this. And they changed their mind. First time in DOJ history, they reneged on a settlement. And so we sued them and won. They countersued and they won. We have now decided to take that to the Supreme Court. And I bring all of this up because the clear cooperation was a part of that. They didn't like clear cooperation because they actually felt through a different lens. And if it's not explained correctly, I can understand. Our rule says if you're on the market within 24 hours, it's got to be on the market on the MLS. They misread that. I could see how they got there to say NAR is guilty under clear cooperation of saying all sellers must be on the MLS. I'm like, and have to pay a commission. It's like, okay, well, in some cases, commission was $0, a penny, or $1 as a minimum. But that triggered a thing in their head saying that's anti-competitive. You have to be on the MLS, therefore you have to offer commission. So we said, hey, we just got sued. We no longer have compensation in clear cooperation. So now we're talking to the DOJ to say, any chance you will revisit that, because now look at the fundamental benefit to the consumer when commission is completely out of the picture. So we're working through this, and we have to wait and see what the Supreme Court does. If the Supreme Court decides to take up the case, we're going to let that ride. If the Supreme Court says, no, we're not taking it up, we will have to make a different decision. But if we started to enter into a conversation around clear cooperation at this moment in time, we may undermine the Supreme Court's decision whether or not they want to take our case on. So we're going to let that happen first. Then we're going to tackle it. And the industry is going to continue to talk about it and frustrate itself no end until that happens.
Yeah. Yeah. And make no mistake. I said this before, but it's worth repeating. There are agendas behind the people that want this to change. There are agendas. They don't truly think, they may not agree, they may not say this vocally, but they don't truly think that this is what's best for the sellers. They want to have their companies have stockpiles of listings that only their companies have, and they want to do, they want to they want visibility on that so they can recruit to their companies.
Yeah, and I talked to leadership about this, and I'm going to mention Leonard Scott. So he and I shared seats, ironically, beside each other last year, going into DC for meetings, and we had a very nice conversation about the family history around the company, et cetera. And I'm not a John Scott agent, so this is certainly not me. But one of the things he commented on, he said, Colin, even if we have 40% market share in a certain market, which they do in my local market, he wants his agents to have access to all of the market, not just the 40%. And that's the exact thing behind why MLSs were created in the first place. And I believe there are several companies that see the bigger picture that want that, but there are a handful that are looking to dissect the market and see opportunity. And they're painting it, I think, in a dishonest way to clients to make them think they're getting a better deal. And in fact, the markets bear out that they're not.
Yeah. Yep. I agree.
And that's a good positive reason to have an MLS per state, right? It's kind of like you're licensed in the entire state, right? In Oregon, you can go from the Columbia River all the way to Medford. You can go, from the coast all the way to Idaho. But if you're in Bend, they have an MLS. If you're in Salem, they have an MLS. If you're at the coast, Clatsop County or Lincoln County, it's like we had Kurt von Wasmuth, CEO of RMLS, on this show like 3 or 4 times. And he said that it's sort of gravitating that way. If you have a major league sports team, you get an MLS, right? So Portland would have one, Seattle would have one. And then the person doesn't have to subscribe to 5 different MLSs, and you get all of the information. If you're a broker and you want to sell something at the coast, it's in your system, right? So that's the benefit for having one strong MLS versus having tons of MLSs. And that's also a positive for not going the clear route where they have listings, but they kind of protect them. So we don't look like idiots when our buyer drives by a sign and says, hey, give me the information on this. And it's like, I don't have any information. And the guy's not calling me back. Because guess what? He knows it's me. If a consumer calls him, he'll probably answer and then be there to show him the house like that. And so I agree, Steve, there are motivations behind it. We didn't talk about during the NAR thing, the truth to the person that brought the lawsuit. I don't know if this was his objective, but he went to start kind of a la carte real estate company. Isn't that correct? Like, hey, here's our menu of services. You pay a flat fee. We show you the house. We negotiate an inspection, and then it closes, and you owe us X. Wasn't that a lot of behind the lawsuit, or did more people speculate after the lawsuit that was going on?
I honestly don't know. But the bottom line is we have those business models existing in our MLSs and in our markets already. And clients choose time and time again to go with a more traditional full representation model when they have choices and they're faced with what they get for the services. So that wasn't any kind of rocket science new idea, but it did feel like there was an agenda bigger than just the lawsuit. Like they get their $900 share of the check or whatever it's going to be. But now I have the competing business model. I'm going to go right back to the earlier question, like this competing association. I believe they got about 5,000 members. Jason Haber's out of New York, I think. He's with Compass. And then there's the gentleman from LA who does the Millionaire Listings TV show. Both of them are looking for clear cooperation to go away. They both work for companies that are pushing for that because it benefits them. These private networks, these in-house sales. So NAR has always welcomed competition. If somebody can come up and offer a better set of services more competitively with our lobbying efforts, which is a big part of what we do, then good luck. And our members can have choices. And I don't mean that disingenuously. But it is really hard to replicate everything that NAR does. And remember, when you pay your dues, 185 of that goes to NAR. The rest of it goes to your state and your local. Each have their own sets of benefits. And I'm only here to talk about that 185, but that 185 has worked really hard for you since 1908. It's the reason people get into business. It's the reason some of these other larger companies that want to do away with clear cooperation were able to get in the business and form their business model in 2012. They were able to do that because of the groundwork that NAR and its members, this is a member organization, it's volunteer-led, the work that they've put in since 1908 that have allowed each and every one of us to get into this business and will allow future generations to get into this business with the opportunity to succeed, not the guarantee. Very different, opportunity to succeed. And that's what NAR has fought for to its core since day one and continues to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great stuff. Did we cover all your questions, Joe?
I think so. What a action-packed, full of information. What's really great about this, we have lots of subscribers, lots of viewers, lots of eyes and ears on us. And, it can be downloaded from all these different platforms. And I don't know where we are, but I know that we crossed the 200,000 downloads a long time ago. Who knows where we are now? I think it's important, Colin, that somebody of your stature and your knowledge and your involvement in the community says these things to some of the brokers that they're just a broker and they just want to make money and don't understand necessarily the liability and all the other things that owners go through and the reasons why things are important to be fair to the consumer and why things are important to be protected from an E&O or company level. So I think this sheds light to a lot of the people that I just want to hold an open house, or why do I have to do a buyer rep agreement now? Hopefully this was kind of the Fisher Price type thing that we can explain it to everyone. And then they realize that the reasons behind it all, instead of this is something you have to do, now they kind of understand it. So I really appreciate it. And I did want to mention, Colin's talking to Steve and myself, and he's in Hawaii. He could be frolicking on a beach with a Mai Tai right now instead of being on a podcast from a hotel room. So we really, really appreciate it. And it just goes to show you're self-employed, you're a realtor, there are no days off. Here you are in Hawaii doing a podcast. We really, really appreciate it. And you're an amazing guest for the show. So thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, thank you both. I appreciate it. And it's been a pleasure. And I've known both of you, Joe particularly, for many, many years, and I've always admired this group. And it was a great opportunity. And I follow the comments on there. I genuinely do. And I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to help shed some light on some of the key tension points, if you will, that our members are experiencing with the changes. But here's to a great 25, and hopefully everyone comes out the other end of this with a more positive outlook and feels better about the market and the profession.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Colin. You were a great guest, and I would be surprised if we don't have you again in the future. And who knows, maybe you'll be the president at that point.
Thanks, guys.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to the Portland Real Estate Podcast, Oregon and Washington's #1 show for cutting-edge real estate discussions. Also, I'd like to give a shout out to the members of Masters in Real Estate, a private and exclusive Facebook group, and the #1 source for all real estate topics. Thanks for being there, gang. I love you. Finally, I want to thank our faithful listeners. Without an audience, we're just two guys talking to each other. Make sure you hit the subscribe button so the new episodes automatically come to you. Make it great.